Okay. Welcome to today's class. So this is CS 303, and today we are going to start a new chapter, which is chapter number 5. So if you kind of see, which direction we are going in terms of this course, the first chapter was an introduction. It introduced what an operating system is. We had a very quick overview of computer architecture. We talked about various kinds of computing systems, right? Servers, desktops, laptops, mobile phones, client server systems, peer-to-peer, cloud, so on and so forth, right? And what did we cover in chapter 2? In chapter 2 we discussed user interfaces, right? So one is using command line, one is using graphical user interface. So how user and programs can interface or interact with the operating system. Then we discuss system calls, very important concept. Anytime a user on an application needs an OS service, a system call has to be made, right? So you have a kernel crossing and then system call is executed on behalf of the user, and then you get back the result. And then later on in chapter 2 we looked at various kinds of operating system design, starting from monolithic kernels like DOS, Linux to a small extent, and then looking at different kinds of operating system design, layered architecture, microkernels, so on and so forth, right? And then in the third chapter, now we started our discussion on process management. Right? So one of the main goals of an operating system is to manage processes or programs, so manage their execution, right? So with that in mind, in chapter 3 we looked at the concept of a process, address space, what are the various components of a process, right? Text or code section, data section, stack, heap, so on. We looked at how processes context switch from one another, how a process during its lifetime can change its state from one to the other, owing to various events, right? For example, if it's running and then suddenly a process has to do I/O, its state changes from running to waiting. Then we looked at various kinds of system calls with regards to processes, right? Fork, exec, exit, wait, and so on. Right, and then later on we looked at various frameworks for process communication, where we looked at pipes and shared memory. So for both we had system calls, and then we looked at some programs for that. So that was chapter 4. Chapter 3. Chapter 4 we looked at the concept of multi-threading. So how within a process we can identify pieces of code that can potentially run in parallel. Right. So we discussed multi-threading. And we discussed a program in which we create many threads, right? So now we move on to a new chapter. So this also deals with process management, and this is one of the major chapters, one of the very important chapters, on which research wise I think probably most amount of work has been done, because it really impacts the performance of an operating system. And this chapter is CPU scheduling. Okay. So today we start a new chapter, lecture 1 in chapter number 5. Title of the chapter is CPU scheduling. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide number 2. Title is chapter 5, CPU scheduling. So this slide gives a blueprint or a roadmap of the various topics that we are going to cover in this particular chapter. Okay. So first is basic concepts and introduction to CPU scheduling. So what is the scheduling problem? What is the CPU scheduling problem, to be more precise? Why is it important? And some introduction about this problem. Next is scheduling criteria. So these are the metrics to optimize. So essentially we have various kinds of scheduling algorithms, and each algorithm as the output, we have to measure how well the algorithm is doing, how good or how bad. So for that we need some measurements of some quantities, some metrics. So what are those metrics? We will talk in in this topic, scheduling criteria. Next we will cover uniprocessor scheduling algorithms. So here the assumption is that the scheduling has to be done on only one CPU, right? So which means at any one point of time, how many processes or programs can run? Well, the answer is 1. Okay. So this is a simple case, and we will discuss a number of single processor or uniprocessor scheduling algorithms. Next we will talk about real-time scheduling. So specific kind of scheduling in which we have deadlines associated with jobs, and the deadlines have to be met. So we'll talk about 2 different algorithms for real-time scheduling, both on single processor. And nowadays we know that even the simplest of devices come with not one CPU but with multiple CPUs. So the discussion of scheduling cannot be complete without discussing at least one multiprocessor scheduling algorithm. Okay. So we will talk about one particular algorithm which considers multiple CPUs. So you have multiple CPUs, which means that at any point of time many programs can run. So you get parallel processing, better output in terms of smaller response times. You get more work done per unit time. Then we will look at operating system examples. So in the major operating systems that we see today, whether it is Windows or Linux or I'm not sure what the third one is. Let me just quickly check. Just give me a second. Yeah, third one is Solaris. So Linux, Windows and Solaris. So Solaris is a variant of Unix, just like Linux. Some differences. So we'll see actually how these operating systems schedule processes. Okay. And finally, algorithm evaluation. Given a set of processes, how do we pick the appropriate scheduling algorithm? So to solve this scheduling problem, many algorithms may exist. How do we pick an appropriate one? Okay. So these are the various topics. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide number 3, the objectives. So after we finish this chapter together, what are the things that you are expected to know, to have a good idea about? So the objectives are to introduce CPU scheduling, which is the basis of multi-programmed operating systems. So we know what multi-programming is. You are doing multiplexing. That means you are overlapping the CPU execution costs and the IO wait times, right? So which means that if a process is executing on the CPU, fine, no problem. But as soon as the process starts to do IO, it goes into wait state, then you give the CPU to some other process. So this is multi-programming. We've been discussing it since chapter number 1. Now, because if from the OS point of view you want to support multi-programming, then what you need to do is you need to keep multiple processes in the main memory. You need to keep the images of multiple processes in the main memory, so that when one process does IO, you can quickly switch to the other process. If you have only one process in memory, then when you want to give the CPU to some other process, where will that process be if it's not in main memory? Right? It is going to be in disk. So by the time you get the process from the disk to execute, that disk IO which the first process was waiting on might already be complete. So the thing goes to waste. But if you have multiple processes in memory, and when one process goes off to do IO, let's say disk IO, you can quickly fetch the other process from main memory. So main memory access times are much smaller, we know, than disk access times. So we have to keep multiple processes in main memory at a particular point of time. Now what question does scheduling answer? The question that scheduling answers is, if a particular process has gone off to do I/O, and I have a set of processes in the main memory, which one am I going to pick next? And then I pick that, and then after that, if again I need to pick a third one, which one do I pick? So that is the question that scheduling will answer. So you need to do scheduling if you want to support multi-programming. Which among those processes in memory do you want to give the CPU to next? Another objective, to describe various CPU scheduling algorithms, right? So we'll be looking at a number of algorithms, and we'll be comparing them as well. Yes, some may be suited to one situation, some may be suited to another situation. We'll explain the issues related to multiprocessor scheduling. So we'll do at least one algorithm for multiprocessor scheduling, and we'll see how that the introduction of multiprocessors makes a scheduling algorithm more complex. Okay. We'll discuss scheduling in Windows, Solaris, and Linux, so you will have a good idea of how these operating systems schedule. Okay. We'll discuss evaluation criteria for selecting a CPU scheduling algorithm for a particular system. So if this is a system, these are the requirements, and these are the set of algorithms you have in your arsenal. We'll be in a better position to pick an appropriate one. So if you want to be fair to all, you pick one particular algorithm. If you want to minimize the average response time, you pick a second algorithm. If you want to guarantee all deadlines are met, you pick a third algorithm, right? And so on and so forth, right? And finally, programs that implement CPU scheduling algorithm. So we'll talk about some programs that will implement CPU scheduling algorithms. So essentially, an algorithm is a piece of code, right? And we'll try to discuss some of that. Okay. Okay. Now I am on slide number 4, which is titled Basic Concepts. Okay. Now we do recognize that scheduling is a very basic problem, right? And is not restricted just to the OS or operating system domain, right? So we deal with scheduling decisions every day, right? Do homework, eat our lunch, dinner, go for a run or jog, chat online with parents, right? So these are the these are the tasks that we have to do. Now what the scheduling problem tells us is in which order do we do them. So in some way we may have some algorithm that among the meals there's some sequence. We have breakfast and lunch and dinner, right? And then in between we can do any of the other activities. So essentially, which sequence of events do we follow is essentially a schedule. Right? So one schedule is wake up, go for a run, have breakfast, right? Do homework, have lunch, chat online with parents, have dinner, end of the day. Right? So that's one particular sequence. Other sequences are also there. You can see there are many permutations and combinations, and you have 4 events. So you have factorial 4 ways of scheduling them. Right? So if you have 2 events, 2 ways of scheduling them. Events are 1 and 2, then 1 followed by 2, then 2 followed by 1. If you have 3, then 6, factorial 3, right? 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, so on, 6 ways. When you have 4, then factorial 4, right? So which is 4 into 3, 12 into 2, 24. So 4 into 3, 12 into 2, 24 ways of scheduling. Okay. Which among those is desirable? That is a question. Okay. So CPU scheduling is a basis of multi-programmed operating system. So as we discussed in the previous slide, we are supporting multi-programming, right? So because of that, we need to keep many processes in main memory at the same time. How many processes we keep depends on how many requests are there, and how much main memory we have, how much we can spare, right? Decisions are made by the OS, but to support So we need to support multiple processes in main memory, and therefore the scheduling question automatically comes in. Among them, if the CPU is idle and we need to map a process to it, we need to assign a process to it. So among those which are in memory, which one do we assign it to? Right? So that is the question. So scheduling will give us that answer. Okay. So maximum CPU scheduling obtained with multiprogramming. Try to ensure that as long as there is even one process to run, CPU is never idle. So of course we know why we do multiprogramming already, so that our CPU utilization is maximized. As long as we have even one process that wants to execute on the CPU, CPU is never idle. Okay, so idea is to keep several ready processes in memory, right? So essentially there will be a ready queue as we discussed in chapter 3, and each entry in the queue will correspond to a process. It will be a pointer to a process, right? Perhaps a pointer to the process control block. So when a process waits, CPU is given to a process from that queue, right? So scheduling answers the question that from that queue, which process do we give the CPU to? Okay. So that is, that question is answered by the CPU scheduling algorithm. Okay, now I am on slide number 5. Okay, so slide number 5, CPU and IO bursts. Okay, so now the statement we are making is, or the statement the authors are making is, the success of CPU scheduling is based on an important property of processes. And what is that property? Typically, process execution consists of periods of CPU and IO bursts. Okay, so we have a CPU IO burst cycle. So process execution consists of cycles of CPU execution and IO wait and so on. So if you look at the dictionary meaning of a burst means to appear or become visible. Okay, so what this means is, if you look at the execution of a sample process, it will or the life cycle of a sample process, and divided in terms of CPU activity and IO activity. Right. So what you will see is it will have a CPU burst maybe. So in that instructions are executed by the CPU and then followed by IO, then CPU, then IO. So it's sort of one after the other. In a way, it will function go in this way and till the process ends. Now, what is the percentage of CPU and IO? That can vary from process to process. A process may be mostly CPU bound, which is given at the last slide. The last point in this slide. So CPU bound process will typically have long CPU bursts. So most of the for the most of the time in its execution, a CPU bound process will be doing which activity? CPU execution. There will be little or no IO. Okay. Example of such a process could be any batch process like multiplying two matrices, for example. So you input the matrices and then one after the other bunch of instructions, you get the result. There is no IO in between. An IO bound process, on the other hand, will have a lot of IO. In between, you will have CPU. An example could be if you are searching a database for records, right? So let's say you have a student database, and from time to time you are typing in the student ID, and then you're getting the transcript, grade sheet. Now the time it takes to locate the student in the database and output the transcript is very less, very fast operation. But between consecutive requests, you may have 5 seconds that between successive requests, the time period could be 5 seconds, could be 10 seconds, could be 1 minute, could be even 1 day, 2 days. You don't know, right? So then what's happening is you have a CPU activity which is occurring for a short period of time, which is taking that student ID which has been input, searching in the database and outputting the appropriate record. and the IO activity is waiting for the next request. So this could be a good example of an IO bound process. Doing CPU for a bit, then IO for maybe for a long time. So CPU part maybe it executes in a couple of milliseconds, and then after 5 seconds another request. 5 seconds in human time is still quite quick. Right? Maybe 2 minutes also. So such a process which has a lot of IO is an IO bound one. Okay. So of course duration of CPU and IO bursts vary from one process to the other. They will also depend on the hardware. Faster CPU means the same number of instructions can be executed faster. Faster disk means the IO will happen quicker. So it varies. The duration of these CPU and IO cycles varies from machine to machine. It varies from process to process. Okay. So they have been measured extensively by researchers. And in this is slide 5. So in slide 7 we will see one such sample CPU burst time graph. Okay. So it shows a large number of short CPU bursts followed by a small number of large CPU bursts. So we'll look at this in slide 7. But from this slide what we take away is, if you analyze a process, it has some component of that process is devoted to CPU activity, and some components of that process are devoted to IO activity. So CPU, then IO, then CPU, then IO, and so on. To what degree? It depends from process to process. And therefore we can have two categories: CPU bound, in which most of the times the process is executing instructions, or instructions are of that process are being executed by the CPU, and IO is little or no IO or little IO. IO bound is sort of the reverse. Most of the time it's doing IO and very little CPU. Okay. So here we see an alternating sequence of CPU and IO bursts for a process. Okay. So the code we see is actually in the instructions format. Okay. So first CPU burst, what does it contain? So it's going from top to bottom. Load, store, add, store, read from file. Loads and adds, load instruction, add instruction, file read instruction. So all of these are CPU activities. These are instructions which are executed by the CPU with some arguments. So that's what the first CPU burst consists of. And then next you have an IO burst where you're waiting for some IO, perhaps from the keyboard, perhaps a voice, right, like Alexa, or perhaps from the disk. Right? So any kind of IO. That's the first IO burst. Second CPU burst, some other instructions are executed: store, increment, index, write to file. Second IO burst, waiting for IO. Third CPU burst, load, store, add, store, read from file. And then third IO burst. So what we are seeing here is an alternating sequence of CPU burst followed by an IO burst. Okay. So critical thing over here is when this process is doing an IO, so typically those IO times are longer, and when this process is doing IO, the CPU can be given to some other process. Okay. So because IO times are longer, so you can get more work done. And if the IO times were very small, then this multi-programming would not be that effective, because by the time you bring that process in, the original process is already ready to do the next CPU burst. But typically IO times are much longer than CPU times, or IO bursts are much longer than CPU bursts. So while a process is having an IO burst, you give the CPU to another process. Which process do you give the CPU to? The scheduling will answer that question. Okay. So of course the longer IO burst is, more processes you can accommodate. So now I am on slide number 7. This is a histogram of CPU burst times. Okay. So what they've done is over here they're plotting. On the x-axis they have the burst duration, on the y-axis they have the frequency. Okay. So this could be for one process or for many processes. So let's say you have done some analysis on the process or on the processes, and this is what you come up with. Okay. So looking at this shape of this curve, this we can say is exponential, right, or hyper exponential. And what we see here is initially a large frequency is quite high, right. So what we are seeing is a large number of short bursts, right. So burst duration is given, it's not labeled, but you can see it, values closer to 0, they are quite large in number, and eventually it's peaking. So for that particular value, a maximum number of bursts, and then after a while it goes down, and then sort of the curve stabilizes, and when it's stabilizing, it's almost a straight line. You can see the burst duration is large, but the number of such bursts is small, right. So what we see over here is a large number of short CPU bursts and a small number of large CPU bursts. Okay. So generally, researchers have seen that when you have a large number of small CPU bursts, typically you have a lot of I/O bound processes. If you look at CPU bound processes, most of the time they are executing on the CPU. So which means that they have large CPU bursts. If you have a large number of bursts, CPU bursts, but the duration is small, it means you may have a large number of I/O bound processes. Okay. So the I/O bound process will have many short CPU bursts, like you're seeing in the beginning, and a CPU bound process will have a small number of long CPU bursts, as you're seeing at the end. Now note that the distribution that we get can be useful or can be exploited by the scheduling algorithm. Okay. So which means, so let's say you have a set of processes coming in. So perhaps you may want to give the CPU to the I/O bound first. You may give priority to I/O bound first. The reason for that is they'll anyway be using the CPU for a small amount of time, and then they'll go off and do I/O, and then they will be doing I/O for a long period of time. So very quickly you can give the CPU to many of the I/O bound processes, and in a small amount of time you are processing large number of processes. Now if you give the CPU instead of the I/O bound, if you give it to the CPU bound processes, so what will happen is those CPU bound processes, maybe smaller in number, will sort of block the large number of I/O bound processes, which may not be good in terms of your throughput. Throughput is number of processes serviced per unit time, or number of processes for which some progress has been made per unit time. So if you put the CPU bound processes first, your throughput may not be good, because the CPU bound will block the I/O bound for a long time. They will hog the CPU for a long time. Whereas on the other hand, if you give the priority to I/O bound first, then very quickly they will be using the CPU. Right? I/O bound process 1 will use the CPU very quickly. Give it to I/O bound 2, then I/O bound 3, I/O bound 4, and when within a short time duration, you've serviced a large number of processes. Good throughput. So for this particular distribution, maybe you want to prioritize the I/O bound processes first. So what we are saying is distribution of the CPU and I/O bursts can be exploited by the scheduling algorithm. Okay. Hello. Yeah. Now I am on slide number 8. Title of which is CPU scheduler. Okay. So definitely this is a module which takes care of scheduling the processes onto the CPU. Okay. So a very important module definitely. What's the main task of the scheduler? Selects from among the processes in memory that are ready to execute, which means that are in the ready queue, and allocates the CPU to one of them. So at any point of time there will be a ready queue of processes. As the name suggests, they are ready to execute on the CPU. And what the scheduler does is whenever it's invoked, whenever it's called, it runs the scheduling algorithm which decides which is the next process to pick. So that's a job. Okay, so ready queue is list of processes that are ready to execute on the CPU. So PCBs are linked together in the queue, as we saw in chapter number 3. So you have a sort of a linked list of process control blocks. One is at the head, then a link to the second and 3, 4. You know how to implement linked lists. So the process control blocks are linked together, and then the CPU scheduling algorithm picks one from the queue, and it can pick a process depending on the scheduling algorithm. So we do recall that a process can be in many states during its lifetime. So whenever it changes a state from one to the other, in many of those state transitions, scheduling decisions have to be made. So for example, when it is switching from running to waiting state. Okay. So let me go back and try to pull out that figure. So when a process switches from running to waiting state, right? So now what that means is, so again in all of our discussions so far, we are assuming that there is only one CPU. Okay, only one CPU. So a process is running on the CPU, and then it goes off and does I/O. Right. So which means it goes into a waiting state. So now a scheduling decision has to be made. We have to go to the ready queue, and based on the scheduling algorithm, we have to pick one of the processes in the ready queue to execute. So scheduling decision has to be made. When a process switches from running to ready state, right? So it is running. So let's say it's running for a particular time period, and you have a timer interrupt which says that no process can run for longer than this time period. So why you may want to have such an interrupt? Just to ensure that long running processes do not hog the or do not take undue control of the CPU, because you want to give a good response time to all processes. Note that number of CPUs is less, number of processes is much more. So a process runs for a particular point of time, after which an timer interrupt occurs, and now you have to take away the CPU from the process. Now it is not doing that process is not doing I/O, so it's not going to waiting state. Which state is it going to from running state? It is going to a ready state. So now again in that ready queue, which position it will occupy will depend on the scheduling algorithm. Okay. If it's a first come first serve, it will occupy the last position. Okay. When a process switches from waiting to ready, so process is doing I/O, and let's say the I/O is finished. Now its state changes from waiting to ready. Now in ready again, where in that ready queue is the process going to be inserted? Okay. Is it going to come in the beginning? Is it going to come at the end? Is it going to come somewhere in the middle? Where in that ready queue is the process going to be added? So that depends on the scheduling algorithm that the OS has in place. When a process terminates, of course it's running, it's over. So one less process, and now process that was running, once it finishes execution, of course you have to give the CPU to some other process, a new process now. So again a scheduling decision has to be made. So you can see that scheduler is invoked quite heavily during these state changes of processes. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide 9, and this is a diagram of the process states, right? So this is just taken from chapter 3, because in the previous slide we were discussing the point that on many of the state changes scheduling decisions have to be made, right? So we discussed from waiting to ready, when it's terminated, from running to ready, and so on. So this just shows the process state, and during some of these state changes scheduling decisions have to be made, which means scheduler has to be invoked, either to decide which process to run or to determine where in the ready queue a particular process should be placed. So that will depend on the scheduling algorithm, definitely. Okay, so in order to make these two decisions, the scheduling algorithm will be very important, will be essential. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide number 10, which talks about an important module which is related to the scheduler. This module is called a dispatcher. So what is this dispatcher and what does it do? Okay, so dispatcher module gives control of the CPU to the process selected by short-term scheduler. So what will happen is you will have a ready queue of processes, right? N number of processes in that ready queue. Now your short-term scheduler, so just to clarify, all the scheduling that we have been talking about, this is a short-term scheduling. So among the processes resident in memory, which one do we pick? So the short-term scheduler will be invoked. It will select a process from the ready queue. Now next thing which has to be done is the control of the CPU has to be given to that process so that the process can start executing. So the the part of the OS which does that job is the dispatcher. Okay. So of course this will involve switching context. Prior to this, another process may have been running. So we need to do a context switch from that. So in this slide it shows initially P0 is executing, and then what we do is we decide the short-term scheduler decides that now CPU should be given to P1. So we have to have a context switch between P0 and P1, and as we learned from chapter number 3, as part of the context switch, what are the events that we have to look at? First we have to save the context of process P0. So save the state into PCB0 so that we can resume it later, right? So things like register contents, program counter, and so on, stack, heap, content, so on. Now, and then what we do is, because we want P1 to run, so we have to restore the state from PCB1. So assuming P1 was already running, it was interrupted, we have to bring its context back in. If it's a new process, fresh, we have to initialize PCB1 fresh, and then we have to let P1 run. So we switch context, we switch to user mode, and we jump to the proper location in P1 where we execute. So all this is part of the dispatch latency. So dispatch latency is the time it takes for the dispatcher to stop one process and start another process. So chunk of this goes into the context switch time. So dispatcher should be fast, definitely, because a slow dispatcher means dispatch latency is high. And while we are doing this dispatching business, the CPU is idle. So larger is the dispatch latency, CPU will be idle for a longer time. So ideally we want this dispatch latency to be as small as possible, so that we can give the P1 can start executing, for example, as early as possible, right? At time t is 10 as opposed to at time t is 12, right? Now in Linux we can look into a particular process and see information about the context switches. So what you can do is go to on a terminal, type cd /proc, PROC. So this is the process directory, and then do an ls, see which processes are there, and then go to any one particular process. So while you're in the PROC directory, let's say you want to go to 2166, so process with process ID 2166, so do cd 2166, and then there will be a file there called status, so which you can peek at. So here I am using the VI editor. You can use any other editor that you want. So VI status. So for 2166, what is the status? And then at the last pieces of information I see are the context switches. So the one I opened was for the bash. So I opened the terminal process, and it says voluntary context switches is 56, non-voluntary context switches is 0. So since my machine was running, it's been about close to 2 hours. Terminal has been open mostly all the time. The number of context switches has been 56. So they are divided into two categories: the context switches, voluntary and involuntary. Difference is not that hard to see, and the answer is in the name itself. In the case of involuntary context switch, the CPU is forcibly taken away from the process. So if it's a badly behaving process, if after using a particular the CPU for a particular point of time, it's not letting go of it, then you have to the scheduler has to forcibly take away the CPU. So that is a non-voluntary context switch. The process doesn't want to give away the CPU, but still you are taking it away. Voluntary means it's well behaved, so it says fine, I'll run for 5 milliseconds and then I'll voluntarily give the CPU to some other process, and then again 5 milliseconds and so on. So like this you can see the context switches. So this is a good exercise. Go to your process directory, go to the directory of a particular process, and look at the contents of the status file. It'll give you the context switches. It will give you a lot of other information. How many threads there are? It says one thread. What is the name of the process? Bash. What is the state of the process? S, sleeping. What is the process ID? 3822. What is the parent process ID? 3566. Right? Information on memory. Right? A lot of information on memory. Bunch of addresses and so on. Okay. CPUs allowed. So on. So it would be a very good exercise to sort of look into this. Okay. So now I am on slide 11, talking about preemptive versus non-preemptive. Right. So this is we can have two classes of scheduling algorithms, or two types of scheduling, two classes of scheduling, non-preemptive and preemptive. What is the difference between the two? In non-preemptive scheduling, one CPU is allocated to a process. Process keeps the CPU till it releases it. And we know when will a process release the CPU? Either when it's finished, terminated, or by switching to waiting state to do I/O. So either the process finishes and it gives up the control of the CPU, or process has to do I/O and it goes to waiting state. So, but besides this, the process keeps the CPU. Okay. So the process, once it's allotted the CPU, it is the execution of the process is not interrupted by the OS unless the process is doing it on its own, either by finishing its execution or by going off and doing I/O. So which means if it's a extremely long running CPU process with no I/O, then it will not be interrupted till it finishes execution. Okay. What is preemptive scheduling? Once CPU is allocated to a process and it is running, the process may be interrupted to run another process. So you have let's say long running process, and let's say it runs for 10 milliseconds, and then the OS says fine, that's all you had. Now we will take the CPU away from you and give it to another process. So a preemptive scheduler can do that. A non-preemptive scheduler cannot do that. Which process will the CPU be given to new? Again, depending on the algorithm, usually the new process will have a higher priority, because in a priority based scheduling, at any given point of time, the process with the highest priority is given the CPU. So if a lower priority is running and a higher priority is there, CPU is given to the higher priority one. So in non-preemptive, CPU process gets to keep the CPU until it gives it up, either by finishing execution or by going off and doing I/O. In preemptive, process can be interrupted. The execution of a process can be interrupted, and the CPU can be given to some other process. Okay. So which one is better? There is no easy answer to that. As it turns out, preemptive is generally good for implementing priority based scheduling, because in priority based you always want to run the task with the highest priority. And let's say you have a dynamic system in which new processes keep on coming in. So it may so happen you have given the CPU to the highest priority at that point of time. After some time, t plus 20 something, a higher priority process comes in, enters the ready queue. Well, then if you have preemptive, you can give the CPU to the new process. If you have non-preemptive, you cannot. So if you want to support priority based scheduling, preemptive is the way to go. But the downside is the overhead. Every time you're preempting a process, again what is happening, you're doing a context switch. There's an overhead involved. So too many preemptions will lead to a large overhead, which will bring down the utilization. So too many preemptions are also not good. So both have their advantages and disadvantages. In non-preemptive, you cannot support. There's a chance that a long process will hog the CPU, so it will not be very fair. But on the other hand, the overhead for preemption or overhead for context switches is very less or not there. So both have their plus and minus points. And so the general general guideline is, even when you are using preemption, try to use it in a controlled manner. So throughout this chapter, we will be discussing both preemption and non-preemption. Okay. So now I am on slide 12, and in the next couple of slides, the last set of slides for today's lecture, we talk about scheduling criteria. So we have now we have a good idea of what scheduling is, right? And that we can have different kinds of scheduling algorithms. And we know scheduling is needed to support multi-programming, right? So now the thing is, how do you measure the performance of your scheduling algorithm? So you have to measure the performance based on some metrics, some criteria. So now we will discuss some of these criteria, some of the popular ones. First scheduling criteria, CPU utilization. We know about this already. What is CPU utilization? Percentage of time spent in executing instructions. So conceptually, CPU utilization varies from 0 to 100. Right. So if you have a Windows-based machine, you can look at the task manager. If you have a Linux machine, you can look at system monitor. If you have an Apple-based machine, you can look at activity monitor. So different operating systems have different names for this. But as such, using these programs, you can look at the the utilization of various hardware. So here I am seeing on my Linux machine CPU utilization. So I've got 6 CPUs. CPU 1 utilization is 1, then 2, then CPU 2 it's 2, 3 is 0, 2. So it's fluctuating between 0 and 3, something like that. So lightly used. If you run a lot of jobs, so let's say if I'm doing it on my Windows machine. So just give me a second. So here on my Windows machine, I'm seeing CPU utilization is about 35%. 35%. And my Google Chrome is using Task Manager, Antivirus, all of those are using. Likewise, if I do in Mac, I can also see in Activity Monitor. So you can see the utilization, and generally, theoretically, it varies from 0 to 100. So it's ideally never 0, because even if you have no user applications running, if your OS is operational, the kernel applications, kernel programs are still running. So theoretically, it's never 0. And what we are saying is, realistically, value of 0 may also not be achievable. So one reason for that is context switches. Whenever you are doing a context switch, that is dead time as far as the CPU is concerned, and therefore theoretically we can never be 100. but we can be close to 100. So maybe we can achieve 90, 95, and so on. Okay. Other metric, throughput, number of processes that complete their execution per time unit. Okay, so time unit depends on you. It could be 1 second, it could be 1 millisecond, depends on the system, depends on the designer. So, but as such, number of processes that complete their execution per time unit. So again, this number could vary depending on the size of the processes, right? For a long process, it could be 1 process per second, or 0.5 process of a process per second. For short processes, it could be 10 processes per second, or even 1000 processes per second. Turnaround time, amount of time to execute a particular process. So this is the interval from the time of submission of a process, the time in which a process enters the system, to its completion, when it has no more execution to do. So this will include the time spent, of course, executing on the CPU, instructions executing, time doing I/O, time waiting in the ready queue, time waiting on the disk. So sum of all of these times will give the turnaround time. The duration of time between which you submit the process into the system and the process ends. Okay. Now I am on slide 13. We talk about some more scheduling criteria here. Waiting time. Waiting time is the amount of time a process has been waiting in the ready queue. So let's say it enters a ready queue at time t, and let's say it leaves the ready queue at time t dash. So what is t dash minus t? That is the waiting time for that process. And from that, you can, once you calculate the waiting times for all processes, you can get the average wait time. Okay, so later on we'll do numericals in which we calculate all of these quantities. Response time. Amount of time it takes from when a request was submitted until the first response is produced, which is not the final output. So maybe you have an interactive process going on, and what happens in this, you have a bit of CPU computation, CPU burst followed by IO burst, then again CPU burst, and again IO burst, and so on. Right? So this is what we call an interactive process. So in an interactive process, one metric which is very useful is response time. So you make some CPU request when you're in the first CPU burst, and then eventually you get a response for that request. So what is the time in getting that response is the response time. And then you'll do again IO, and then again another CPU event will be triggered, response time for that. So once you have for all these events, you can get the average response time. So this is generally used for interactive processes, right? For example, let's say a video game. So you're playing, you're driving a car, you tilt your steering wheel to the left. So some action, some computation has to be performed, and accordingly the video frames are adjusted, and then you go to the left. Then you may go to the right. Then you may stop. Then you may accelerate. Then you may brake. So each of these events is some CPU activity, and once you do the activity, some computation happens, and you get back the output which you see on your video game screen. Car stopping, car accelerating, car turning left, car turning right. You see those video frames. So the time elapsed from which you started that CPU activity, for example pressing the brake, to the time in which you see the corresponding changing of the images on the screen, the video on the screen, which means your car coming to a stop. So difference in those times is the response time. So that's one nice example we can have. Okay, so these are some of the scheduling criteria. Now I am on slide 14, last slide for today's lecture. So the question is, of course, so all of these are scheduling criteria, so which means they have to be optimized in some manner. So optimized generally means either maximized or minimized. So what do we do with all of these? How do we optimize them? CPU utilization. Is it maximized or minimized? Well, it has to be maximized, right? So if you have a sufficient number of processes in the system which want to execute, the utilization should be high rather than low. Throughput, what about throughput? Number of processes either executed or made certain amount of progress per unit time has to be maximized. So in our earlier example, what we can do is, if you have a large number of IO bound processes and a small number of CPU bound processes, maybe schedule the IO bound first. They will use the CPU for a very small amount of time. So in a small time period, we can ensure that many of them have gotten a chance to execute. Turnaround time, summation to completion. What does how is this optimized? Should it be maximized or minimized? So definitely it has to be minimized, right? Waiting time again should be minimized. So generally a process in a queue should not have to wait for too long. So if you have some kind of fairness inbuilt into your algorithm, if that fairness is there, then you can sort of guarantee that a process does not wait too long in the ready queue. So we'll look at such an algorithm. So waiting time has to be minimized. Response time, of course, has to be minimized also. If you hit the brake and if your car stops in that video game, if that car stops after 5 seconds, will you like it? Of course not. If it stops after 10 milliseconds, very good. Okay. So we will soon see that some of these criteria are conflicting. For example, CPU utilization versus response time. Another example, average turnaround time versus maximum waiting time. So this we don't have time in today's class. We will discuss this in the next class. So the problem over here is some of these criteria are conflicting. So if you are optimizing one, if we're trying for a good performance in one, we sort of have a worse performance in the other criteria. So we're doing some event to maximize criteria 1. So that event or that action will lead to worse performance in terms of the other criteria. So we'll soon see. Scheduling is an NP-hard problem for all but the very simplest of cases. So this problem is very easy to phrase. Problem definition is extremely clear. You're given a set of processes. You're given one CPU or a set of CPUs. Now you have to figure out their order of execution, right? The sequence in which they are executed and for how long. So problem definition is extremely simple. Problem is very challenging to solve, NP hard. Okay. So then as we do with all NP hard problems, we relax some of the assumptions and try to make the scheduling problem a bit easier to solve. So an easier assumption or an assumption that makes the scheduling problem easier to solve. For example, we'll assume processes do not communicate. So that case is easier to solve. We'll assume single CPU. That case is easier to solve versus multiple CPUs. When we are considering multiple CPUs, we'll assume homogeneous CPUs, which means they are all alike in terms of hardware capability. Heterogeneous means all CPUs have different execution rates. So homogeneous case is easier to solve. So we try to make assumptions and then we try to solve the simpler ones first. Okay.